Today we're going to start looking into genetics, and it's the study of heredity, how we inherit our traits from our parents, and how those traits are passed down. So the little meme here, it's the guy's got a striped shirt, the mom sideways stripes, like horizontal stripes, the mom's got vertical stripes, and then the boy has both. And that's not really how it works. It's not necessarily a blending of traits. It's there's kind of more to it than that. It's not quite that simple. So here we go. Let's talk a bit about genetics first. So this little guy here, this is actually a picture of a DNA molecule, what it would look like. So that's that twisted ladder that we were talking about. It's called a double helix. A geneticist is just a scientist that is looking at heredity. They look at how we inherit our traits from our parents. One of the first geneticists was Gregor Mendel, and he did a bunch of experiments with inheritance within pea plants, so looking at tall plants, short plants, wrinkled peas, smooth peas, and how those traits are passed down. Now, we know traits are inherited depending on the genes we get from our parents, so all of the traits that make you are inherited from your parents, your blood type, your hair color, your eye color, whether you can roll your tongue or not, these kinds of things. So, if we break down kind of all of these things, because I know we're getting some things confused, cells and chromosomes and genes and all DNA and all this stuff. So think of we have a cell, and within that cell you have a nucleus, and the nucleus contains chromosomes, and we have 23 pairs. One of the pair is from mom and one of the pair is from dad, and those pairs we call them homologous pairs because they're coding for the same traits. So if this is what a chromosome looks like, this would be a double-stranded chromosome because it's been copied. If you uncoiled it, it's consisted of genes. So cells have chromosomes. Chromosomes are made of DNA, and sections of that DNA is genes. And the DNA has those A's and T's and C's and G's, and the order of those is what gives us that code for our genes. But one section of the DNA would give us a gene. So genes make chromosomes, DNA makes genes, genes make chromosomes. Think of it like that. So geneticists use some terms. So there's lots of vocabulary in biology, but if we break down the words, hopefully it'll make more sense. So a phenotype, this is how you say it, phenotype, is the physical appearance of a trait. It's what you actually see. So the way I remember pheno, it's like physical. They both start with PH. And it's what you see. So you could see that somebody has blue eyes, or that they have brown hair, or that they are short, or they are tall, or they can roll their tongue or not. But you don't know what genes that person has. You might have an idea. You know that they will have a gene, at least one gene that says to have those traits, but you don't know what the other gene might be. So, for example, like Dracula has a peaked hairline. And they call this a widow's peak. So you see he has a very definite peak at the front of his hairline. Whereas another type of hairline is the old George Costanza hairline, which is way before your time. But that's called a smooth hairline, where it doesn't peak forward, it goes backward. So this is genetics. This is determined by the genes that you have. So you see that Dracula has a peaked hairline and George has a smooth hairline. That's what we see, but we don't know exactly which genes they may have. So that brings us to the genotype. Think of it as gene type. What type of genes do you have that give you that trait? So it's the actual genes that you've got from your parents that give you that trait that you see. So Dracula inherited a pair of genes for his hairline, and so did George Costanza. He got a pair of genes for his hairline. So these two people have two completely different hairlines. There must be something different in their gene combination. So let's say Dracula, his mom gave him a peaked hairline gene, and his dad gave him a smooth hairline gene. We would call that genotype a peaked smooth genotype because he's got one of each. And another way to say that is it's heterozygous. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So but if he has one gene that says peaked and one gene that says smooth and he still has peaked, why doesn't he have kind of a mixture? Well, that's not the way genes always work. Actually, for the most part, that's not the way they work. One gene ends up being dominant over the other gene. So in this case, peaked is dominant over smooth. So if you have a peaked gene and a smooth gene, peaked is dominant. It wins, and that's the trait you see. So this is why some people with, let's say, you could have two parents that have brown hair, they could have a baby that has blonde hair because they actually might be carrying a blonde hair gene, even though you see that they have brown hair. So a peaked hairline must be dominant over a smooth hairline. So that brings us to some new terms, dominant and recessive. So that's what we're getting into, dominant genes and recessive genes. So a dominant gene is a gene that actually you see, that's displayed. Doesn't matter what the other gene is. So for peaked and smooth hairlines, peaked is dominant. So even if you have a peaked gene and a smooth gene, you still see peaked. We use capital letters to represent dominant genes. So we're going to just use letters for our genes, and usually we tend to use the letter of the dominant trait. So in this case it was peaked, so we're going to use the letter P. So for hairline, we can use the capital P to represent a peaked hairline. Now a recessive gene is only genes you see when you get two of the same. So for George Costanza to have a smooth hairline, he must have two genes that say smooth hairline. If he had a peaked gene, it would take over and he'd have a peaked hairline. So this is kind of like where blonde hair comes in, blue eyes come in, because these are more recessive traits. So if in order to get those traits, you need two genes that have that say that trait. Whereas if you get one of the dominant genes, it takes over. So we use a lowercase letter. Now, even though it's smooth, we don't switch the letters. We want to keep the letters the same for the traits. So we use a lowercase p to represent the smooth hairline. And there's a typo in here. This should say smooth hairline. So moving along, here are some actual traits. And we're going to look at a bunch in class. And I've got an activity posted so you can check your traits. So being able to roll your tongue, so like you can actually fold your tongue and touch the two sides on top. Some people can actually make like a W shape with their tongues, and that's a trait. Looking at your earlobes, whether they're freely dangling or they're attached at the bottom. Your pinky shape, so if you hold your pinky in front of you and you look at the tip of your pinky, if it's bent, that's a dominant trait. If it's straight, that's a recessive trait. You can try folding your arms. If you put your left on top, that's actually a recessive trait. So of course, I'm doing this as I'm saying it, and I just noticed that I put my left on top. Dimples in your cheeks, not having dimples is recessive. Having dimples is dominant. Having a cleft chin. Well, you might think, well, not very many people have a cleft chin, but it's actually a dominant trait. Well, that's because if people don't have dominant cleft chins, then their children won't have cleft chins because it's recessive. Hitchhiker's thumb. So if you stick your thumb out like you're going to hitchhike, you're looking for a ride, and your thumb bends backwards, that's a recessive trait. Toe length. Most men, it's more dominant to have the second toe is longer than your first toe, than your big toe. And recessive trait is having your first toe bigger than your second toe. And widow's peak. So having a peak hairline is dominant over not having a peaked hairline. There's all sorts of, we can look at lots of these traits, and I want to make sure that we understand that there's often more than one pair of genes that code for these traits. We're going to keep this very simple in grade 9. There's more to it than this. There may be 6 to 10 different genes that determined your eye color, because eye colors are not just blue or brown, they are all different colors. So there's more going on here. So we are making this very simplified. But a really interesting one is that it's actually dominant for humans to have 5 fingers and a thumb, or 6 digits on their hand. But if you look around, nobody actually has, very, very, very few people would actually have 6 digits on their hand, 5 fingers and a thumb. And that's because their parents didn't have 6 digits on a hand. So in order to pass that trait on, you have to have the dominant. If everybody has the recessive genes, then that's all you see. Another example of that is if you go to like Sweden, where most people are blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Well, that's because all their parents are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, so they're only passing on recessive genes. There's no dominant genes to mask the recessive trait. And we'll look at that a little bit more as well as we go. So some more vocabulary that we should talk about. Gregor Mendel, he's the first guy really to study inheritance within a species. Variation means differences. So we all have variation. That's kind of the advantage of sexual reproduction, is that we're all different. A trait is a characteristic of an organism. So, you could talk about eye color, skin color, hair color, height, shoe size. These are traits. Heredity is the passing of these traits from one generation to the next, or to another. And chromosomes are made of genes, and they pair up with chromosomes that code for the same traits, and that's what we call homologous pairs. Now we're going to break the chromosome down into its genes. So genes are portions of chromosomes that code for a specific trait, and they're made of DNA. So if you look on the chromosome, I'm saying like this would be a gene that codes for some sort of trait. And you would actually have, because this chromosome would be, let's say, from mom, so if I have another chromosome that matches it, I can't draw the exact same thing, but if I draw another one that matches it, this chromosome would have another gene here from dad, and that's what makes these a homologous pair. Let's say this chromosome is coding, let's say, tongue rolling. So you're a tongue roller from mom, but dad says non-roller. They don't have to say the same thing, but they're both talking about whether or not you can roll your tongue. So that's what makes them homologous pairs. And then DNA is the code in which the genetic information is stored. So within the cell, you have the nucleus. Within the nucleus, you have the chromosomes. Chromosomes are made of genes, and genes are made of sections of DNA. Great. So again, we talked about phenotypes. Phenotypes are what you see. So having dark hair, rolling your tongue, that kind of thing. Those are what you see. And genotypes are the genes that you have. So with dark hair, the gene dark hair actually is dominant over light hair. So we would use a capital D for dark hair and a lowercase d for light hair. So in order to have dark hair, you would have to have either capital D, lowercase d, or capital D, capital D. You have to have two dark hair genes, or you have to have at least one dark hair gene. In order to have light hair, you would have to have two little d's because they are the recessive genes. So that's what I'm saying. Dominant genes are what takes over. The recessive genes are only showed when they're paired with another recessive gene. Now, homozygous. Again, we've seen this word, homologous pairs, right? Homozygous. I think of this as same zygote. Remember, homo means same. Same zygote. So mom's zygote and mom's gamete and dad's gamete get together, and they're the same in the zygote. The genes are the same. So that means you have identical genes. So either you have two dominants or two recessives. Same zygote is what I think of that. Heterozygous, remember hetero means different. So heterozygous or different zygote, the zygote has different genes. So that's how I think of it. So anytime you have a two-gene combination, and you always have to have at least two genes for a trait. So let's say dark hair, there's three possibilities. You could get a capital D, lowercase d, or lowercase d, lowercase d. So this would be homozygous dominant. And this person would have dark hair because they have two capital genes, two capital Ds. This one is heterozygous. Another word for it is hybrid. They have a mixture of the two genes. I don't like that word because it implies that you're going to get two, like dark and light, and it's going to mix to medium. And it doesn't work like that. This person would still have dark hair. Now, little d would be homozygous recessive, which means that this person would have light hair. So this is why you'll often see more of the dominant traits in the population, because dominant genes take over. So you might, just because it's dominant, though, doesn't necessarily, like I talked about the number of digits on your hand, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the most common. Again, like I said, heterozygous can also be called a hybrid. Now, we can take our gene combinations and like take a snapshot of our chromosome combinations and look at a picture of that, and that picture is called a karyotype. So this would be a karyotype for a human. And you see the chromosome pairs. you can see, like, this would be like mom's chromosome that she gave, and this is dad's chromosome. Every pair has they're homologous, and one comes from mom, one comes from dad. And in humans, each pair codes for certain traits. So the first pair, they're really long, so they have lots of genes on them, but they might code, and I don't know exactly what they code for, but maybe these genes code for your hair color, eye color, skin color, tongue rolling, and toe length. And then the next pair might have other traits in there, so like maybe your hitchhiker's thumb and your bent pinky finger and your hairline. So every chromosome pair codes for certain traits. And the one that's really important for humans is this one, because this is your sex chromosomes. This is what determines your sex, not your gender, but your sex, whether you were born genetically as a male or a female. And in this case, this would be a male because of the Y chromosome. If there were two X chromosomes, two longer chromosomes, that would make a female. So 22 of these chromosomes, those pairs, 22 of them, code for everything except for what sex you are. The 23rd pair is our sex chromosomes, and they give us our sexual characteristics. Girls are XX, and boys are XY. So here's an example of a genotype-phenotype. We'll use hair color again. So having dark hair is dominant, and having light hair is recessive. So because we, just to keep things consistent, we will use the letter for the dominant trait. So since dark is dominant, I'm going to use the letter D. So D is going to be our letter for our genes. The dominant gene will be capital D for dark, and the recessive gene will be lowercase d for light. So here's how we break it down, kind of what I was doing earlier. A person with homozygous dark hair would have capital D, capital D. Homozygous because they have the same, and dark because they're both the dark hair gene, the capital Ds. So their phenotype would be dark hair. So their genes that they have are capital Ds, and their phenotype, is what you see, is dark hair. We can also call these people, they have pure dark hair. Doesn't mean their hair is darker, it just means that they have genes for dark hair. They're purely dark. There's no chance for them to pass on any light hair to their children. Homozygous light hair. So homozygous, again, means same genes, same zygotes. So they're going to have the same genes. And the light hair gene is going to be the lowercase d because it's recessive. So their genotype or their gene type will be little d, little d. The phenotype, we would call this light hair. This person has light hair because they have both recessive genes. We could also call these people pure light hair. They have both genes for light hair. Now, heterozygous genes, hetero means different. So if you have heterozygous, you don't have to say heterozygous dark, heterozygous light. Just heterozygous means you have one of each. So you have the genotype, big D, little d, and your phenotype would be dark hair. Why dark hair, not medium hair? Because the dominant gene is what you see. So with rolling your tongue, you can either do that or you can't. In class, I'm gonna have you guys taste a piece of paper. And if you can taste it, you have the gene that says you can taste it. If you can't, you just can't. There's no in between. You either can or you can't. And that's genetics. And that's the way all of this works. So that's kind of our introduction to genetics.